Hello, everybody. This is the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hello, bestie. I hope you're having an amazing day. See what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts? You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. I am here with my new favorite author, my new friend, Dorie Clark. How are you, Dorie?
I am so good. Thank you so much for having me here.
So we're here to talk about your new book, The Long Game, which just resonated. It resonated with me from the first page to the last page. You are a thought leader. You know, a lot of people use this term thought leader and they throw it around. I mean it when I talk about you. You've written a bunch of books, but this one in particular is, I just think, it's so like well timed. It's like the world kind of needs it now. You teach at the Duke's Business School, and just really excited to kind of dive in with you, pick your brain, and figure out how we can start playing the long game in our own lives.
I love it. Let's do it, my man.
All right, very good. So the premise of the book, if you could sum the book up in 6 words, if you could sum the book up in a couple of words, how would you kind of describe it?
Basically, the long game, playing the long game, is about how to take actions today that will make your life better and easier tomorrow. That's really the gist of how I think about it. How can we know it's good for us? How can we actually get it done?
Yeah, and it's so hard to do because we live in this fast-paced world, and you touch on so many of the reasons I think that folks end up getting sort of trapped in the short-term, sort of psychotic thinking where we're on this like hamster wheel and we're expending all this effort and we're not making any real progress. It's like we're just kind of treading water through life. What was it? I mean, this is what, the 4th book you've written?
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm sure we'll kind of talk about your path to this book, but what was it that was like burning inside of you that you were like, man, I have to just make this, I have to write this book. The world needs this message now. What was that catalyst?
Well, certainly something that intensified while I was in the midst of the writing process. I signed the deal for the book literally right before COVID struck, and writing a book about long-term thinking in the midst of one of the great explosions of short-term thinking, sort of necessary short-term thinking was an interesting experience to have that juxtaposition. And so to your point, I actually feel like now is, I think, a particularly appropriate time for the long game, because most of us, whatever happens with the epidemiology, psychologically, we're ready for COVID to be done. We are transitioning psychologically out of the acute phase of COVID into maybe the more, sort of living with it phase.
Yeah.
And it really becomes time, I think, for us to put a stake in the ground that short-term thinking, we need it sometimes, absolutely, but we can't do it all the time. We have to actually stand up for long-term thinking and long-term plans so we can begin to recalibrate and shape things. But to answer your original question, even before the pandemic, I was curious about these things, largely for me, actually, because for the past 5 years, I've run an online community called Recognized Expert, which is for smart, good professionals that are looking to just make a bigger impact, get their ideas out there. And in the coaching work that I did and my work with the community, I so often saw people who were getting very frustrated about this process, which almost always takes longer than we want, of sharing your ideas and kind of growing your platform. And I wanted to really try to create a bit of a template or a roadmap that people could follow so that whatever their goal is, whatever their professional goal is, they could stay encouraged and be resilient during the inevitable setbacks. Because if it's a meaningful enough goal, almost always there will be setbacks and gatekeepers. And we need to understand how to navigate that so we can actually get to the other side.
When you think about long-term thinking in the context of your coaching or, in the prescription, so to speak, that is captured in your book, do you view that as more of a muscle? And how would you contrast that with like grit, to the extent that that's sort of something that's a little bit more sort of stable or wired into somebody?
Yeah, I definitely think that these are muscles that we can build. I am not a determinist in that way. One of the studies that I quote toward the end of the book, which many of your listeners will be familiar with because it gets talked about in a lot of pop business literature, is the famed marshmallow study by Walter Mischel, where years ago he took a group of kids and he basically said, okay, 1 marshmallow if you want it now, or 2 marshmallows if you can wait 15 minutes. And of course, many kids with a marshmallow in sight had a little trouble with this. But an underutilized aspect of this study, or something that doesn't get talked about quite as much, is the fact that it was not a finding that it's just, okay, some people are permanently one kind of person or the other. It turns out there actually are techniques that you can teach these kids so that they can get dramatically better at being able to be patient and wait and persevere, even when they would like the marshmallow right now. And the same thing is absolutely true for adults and for, intelligent professionals that are trying to achieve a goal. It would be almost insulting, I think, if we said, oh, well, they can't do it. Like, of course we can all do it. Of course we can all become long-term thinkers. It's just the question of having the right framework to do it.
I mean, there's a lot of hope in what you just said, because I think a lot of people, whether they would sort of explicitly label themselves as determinists or not, they kind of fall into this determinist thinking, well, I'm just this way, and I'm just built this way or whatever. And when we can figure out that some of these structures that are maybe trapping us can be broken or shattered quite easily, or just with a little bit of extra effort, it kind of opens up our lives for some outcomes that maybe we thought we would never even be able to achieve. Is that what you found in your coaching and the community that you built?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is very much, I think, a question of mindset and mentality. I mean, certainly if someone is preempting the conversation by checking out and saying, well, it's just not me,
Right.
or, maybe for other people, but I can't do that, then, okay, great. I'll believe you. Sure. You tell me.
Right.
But that's not how I want to live my life. And I actually think that, for all, and I understand, I mean, I'm putting the asterisk on this. I understand this is a very American philosophy, and plenty of people in other cultures would be like, that is not practical. But it is literally true that if you are the person that cuts off the possibility is not there. I mean, God is not going to tap you on the shoulder and have the miracle happen.
Right.
You have to believe it is possible and then work toward it. Of course you work toward it. And will it work out or not? Well, who knows? It might not. But unless you are expending the effort, then it's definitely not going to happen. So I would much rather be in the camp of people who are strategically working towards something and are, smart enough to recognize, okay, sometimes I might need to pivot. Sometimes this might not work out, but there's always something to try, to aspire toward, to work toward.
So I've kind of gotten the sense, as I followed you and as I've learned about you and I've read some of your stuff, you're like what I would call a high agency person. You are kind of, you're the type of person that holds the steering wheel of life and you're driving that vehicle. And that's what you kind of alluded to here. Do you think have you always been that way? And if you have, what do you think that's rooted in?
Yeah, well, thank you, Nicholas. I appreciate it. And because, I'm a fan of that. I believe in high agency here. I think that's a good thing for all of us, right? If we have belief in our own self-efficacy, that if we're setting our mind to something, that we have a good chance of at least eventually being able to accomplish that, I think that is valuable. It's certainly something I try to strive for. It is equally true. It may not come on our time frame, and it may
Right.
not come in the way that we want, because there are a lot of factors and a lot of gatekeepers. But if you are a reasonably intelligent person that is working reasonably hard towards something, I really do believe that over time you can surmount a large percentage of those barriers. But to answer your question, I think it's probably, for me personally, just to go deep, it's probably a combination of having a very encouraging mom who sort of bolstered a lot of my childhood self-esteem, and also a combination of coming out when I was a young teenager as gay, and just having a large percentage of teenage indignation that if other people thought there was something wrong with me, then, F them. That's their problem. That's not my problem.
Right.
And I think that a certain, for better and for worse, I recognize both sides of this. For better and for worse, it has continued through my adult life that unsolicited opinions, unsolicited feedback, like for a lot of people, they take it in, it hurts them, it wounds them. I receive that and I will just throttle the person.
Totally.
Like, I'm like, no, you don't. No, you do not. And I will kind of kill them. And so that gives me a lot of energy.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I kind of have a chip on my shoulder. I feel like I got a lot to prove. And it seems like people who have a chip on their shoulder fall into sort of one of two camps. One side is like you get very jaded and you hate the world and whatever, and the chip on the shoulder ends up sort of weighing you down. And others, it seems like you and I are kind of in this other camp, or hopefully I'm in this camp, but it ends up being a fuel, and it ends up being sort of a catalyst to like make an impact and prove people wrong and so forth. Do you think that framework is correct? And when you see people fall on that negative side, where do you think that jadedness comes from?
Yeah, I think that's really true. Absolutely. It's an interesting question about how things sort of break.
Yeah.
I do think that it is important, whether this derives from family circumstances or, something innate, I'm not sure. But I do think it's important to have a decent baseline level of self-esteem so that you understand when you're receiving external messages, well, that's not accurate, that,
right.
You're getting some kind of a disjunct.
Yeah.
And then you can fuel that. There's got to be something inside you that says, no, I'm not going to accept at face value what other people are telling me. And I think this is really where a lot of professionals go wrong, unfortunately, is like, and I have so much empathy for it that, they get one rejection,
right.
One agent doesn't want their book, or one, conference organizer says, yeah, no, we're not interested in you.
Right.
And they're devastated and they don't try again. And they just, oh, well, I guess I'm not good enough. And it literally could mean, it could mean that. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it also could mean 99 other things, including that the person didn't have lunch that day and was grumpy. And
you're right.
To take it at face value with like one or two data points is just tragic to me. I never want good, smart people to succumb to that. Fine if it's 100 people, fine if it's 1,000 people, but one or two are absolutely even more likely to be a statistical anomaly than not.
That's a great point. And yeah, I think you're right. As you're answering that, I'm like, yeah, that feels like the right answer. You have to have some confidence in yourself to like accept or reject the stimulus that's being frankly labeled on you, right? Like people are putting these labels and saying, no, that book stinks, or no, that's a bad idea, or no, you're not right for the job. If you internalize that and that breaks your dream or something, then the odds of you sort of falling onto that jaded side of the spectrum are probably a lot higher,
Yeah. So what's your chip on your shoulder? What are you trying to accomplish?
Good question. Wow. You spun it on me now, huh? I was told a lot, not from like my family always built me up for sure, but I was told a lot from the world that, I couldn't do what I wanted to do. And I was told that I couldn't get into the field that I wanted to get into. I was told by other people around me that we couldn't, my brother and I, we ended up buying a company and we're trying to grow this company. There's so many naysayers, and I'm just like, well, first of all, how do you know? Like, do you have a crystal ball? No, you don't. I don't know. I just take it personal or I take it personally maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a great question. I feel like I should lay on a couch here and maybe really start. But I just believe I can make a dent in on the world, and I believe who better than me to do it. I'm not saying I'm the smartest person, but I definitely care, and I'm definitely willing to work hard. And it's kind of like what you were saying. I think that if you're reasonably smart and you are willing to work hard, then why can't you drop that rudder in the ship, into the waters of life and steer the boat where you want it to go? It's like I take offense to somebody saying my rudder doesn't work or something.
Amen. Absolutely. I think sometimes we get so precious about things. This is, one of the themes that I talk about in the long game is, 20% time and sort of taking these experiments. And one of my experiments of the last few years is learning to write musicals, which my big goal is to get a musical that I've written on Broadway in the 2026 season. And I think so many people kind of frame it backwards because they say, oh, they take like the most talented person in the world. Well, I just look at Stephen Sondheim and I know I'm not as good as Stephen
Right.
Sondheim. And and like, that's not the point. The point is Stephen Sondheim is not the only writer who gets on Broadway. Like, if you look in any given season on Broadway, some of it is rubbish. It is
Totally.
certified rubbish. And what I like to prefer to do, and I think we could do this in pretty much any field, is to look at the terrible stuff and say, oh my God, well, I might not be the best, but I'm definitely better than that.
Exactly. One of the most empowering things ever. So like, I've always kind of suffered from imposter syndrome in spite of the, what I just said, am I good enough? You kind of have this feeling like, well, I think I can do it. I don't know. And you get this sort of negative stimulus and you try to fight through it. And I think that's kind of the root of a lot of the imposter syndrome. And I remember there was this person I looked up to, and they were like, the quintessential business person. It's like, man, this person totally has it together. They know exactly what they're doing. They probably never have a knot in their stomach or whatever. Like, they know the plays to run. And I saw this interview and they were being super authentic and they were like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just kind of figuring it out as I go. And I was like, well, I can do that. I don't know what I'm doing either. It's the same kind of thing. You can get some confidence from that. And, this person that you just mentioned, at some point they were submitting their first musical. And at some point they were super nervous. You get to a certain point where you have had so much success, or you've, walked to that boxing ring so many times where you're used to kind of processing those feelings of anxiety. Again, just recognizing that at some point they felt like you felt can be a massive fuel and a massive encouragement to take that plunge,
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I love that, your goal is in 2026. I mean, that in and of itself is so powerful, and it's a sort of a manifestation of what the whole book is about. Do you think you've always had this long-term thinking? Is it a light bulb that was turned on? And I'd love for you to kind of talk about that in the context of launching this community, because I'm sure that grew like everything else, which is not in a straight line, but on some sort of parabolic curve.
Yeah. Well, to answer your first part of your question, was I always a long-term thinker? I suppose relatively, but I really want to specify that sometimes, again, I think we put up a lot of barriers for ourselves. Some people say, oh, but it's so hard to be a long-term thinker. I don't know, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think it's actually that hard for most of us to come up with things we'd like to do. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if ... I think the problem is that we often have created such a high bar for ourselves that what it looks like or what it sounds like to us is, oh God, if I announce that I have this like 20-year goal, I'm going to have to know exactly how to accomplish it. No, you don't. That's the whole point of a 20-year goal. Nobody knows.
Right.
There could be a nuclear apocalypse between here and then. Like, nobody knows. But there's no reason why you can't have that as kind of a, like a North Star and say, you know what? I mean, in my case, I do have a 20-year goal. My 20-year goal is to become a United States ambassador. Now, I don't really know what that would entail exactly. Probably what it means, most likely, is that I'd have to raise a ton of money for some candidate that wins the presidency.
Right.
So this is a little dicey. Do I know who's going to be running for president in 16 years? No, I don't have any idea. But I mean, for all I know, they could be like in college now and not even in politics.
Right.
But ultimately, it's just saying, all right, well, this is interesting. I'm going to keep my eye on possibilities that would enable me to somehow get slightly closer to that or learn more about that realm. That's all it is. I don't have a comprehensive plan for it. That unfolds over time through doing. And so the beauty about long-term thinking is that we don't have to know. We don't have to have it mapped out. And I think that can be freeing for some people.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And, that saying, and if it's not a saying, it should be like, how do you climb a mountain? It's like one step at a time, the same way you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. But like, the point is you have to have your eye on that mountain and on that mountaintop, because you don't know what every single step is. And you don't know if you get to this pass, if it gets snowed over, you have to find another way around it. And that tenacity, again, is perhaps a muscle that we can build over time. But that seed of that dream, or at least having the courage to like, plant that seed and start talking about it, I think is perhaps the first step that a lot of people, to your point, are very scared to even, initiate.
Absolutely.
So I love this distinction that you made in the book about patience and strategic patience. Can we talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's a really profound distinction.
Yeah, thank you. So I am one of those people that would always get frustrated, certainly when I was a kid, but even throughout my adult life, where so often people will tell you almost as a synonym for, hey, just shut up. They tell you, just be patient.
Totally.
And it sounds so patronizing.
Yeah.
Because really what they're saying is just sit back, be quiet, just do your thing. Don't make trouble.
Let life happen to you. Exactly.
Yeah. And that's not how I want to live my life.
Right.
It's like, oh, good. I'll just make a vision board and then magic will happen. That sounds like a good plan. I mean, it's a little ridiculous. I don't want to be patient in the sense of like sitting on a Barca lounger waiting for life to happen. So for me, strategic patience is a term that I created to reflect a little bit more about how I want life to operate. And I think it can, which is we have to recognize there are certain things, unfortunately, that we just can't speed up. We speed up what we can, but there's certain things you just can't. They're going to take a while, and they may, in fact, take longer than we want them to. That is the part we have to deal with. Mm-hmm. But we can be strategic about it, not just like waiting for life to happen to us, but making a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis through action and things we're actually doing, and hopefully getting there a little bit faster, at least, because we're not just waiting for something that might not ever happen. We are evaluating what is happening. And if it seems like it's not working after you've given it a really good college try, okay, fine, we'll pivot a little bit. We'll try something else. But it's a continual process of simultaneously holding two truths, which is things may take a while and we do have to be patient, but we do not have to be passively patient. We can be active in that process.
Again, it's kind of manifesting agency in something that takes a long time. Like if you and I were going to start a single malt scotch business, we can't just wave our fingers and start selling 15-year-old scotch tomorrow, right? To your point, there's a bunch of stuff. I mean, part of that is that it has to wait 15 years, but there's things you can do to kind of take advantage of that. Again, building a hypothesis and playing an active role in it. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit because there's so much stuff in the book that really I was like, oh man, I got to talk to her about this. You talk about, I mean, this is just absolutely mind-boggling to me. 96% of people don't have time for strategic thinking. When, and backing up, you also kind of talk about this framework of how being busy ends up being a sort of a perceived asset and sort of ends up trapping us in these sort of prisons of, busy work that allow us, that, prevent us from like ascending to, a bigger impact or a more strategic role in whatever world we're working in. What do you think is at the root of that, and how do we start to break out of that?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors associated with all of this, and I'm glad that you're zeroing in on it. So ultimately, where this kind of arose, I started doing some research a few years ago. I was asked to speak at a conference in Vienna, sponsored by the Peter Drucker Forum, and they were interested in having me give a talk about strategy. So I was kind of brainstorming. I'm like, well, what should I focus on? And one of the things that occurred to me pretty early on was, okay, to me, the interesting thing about strategy and strategic thinking is like, number one, everybody thinks it's important. Like everybody will pay lip service. Like, yes, we need to be very strategic. Like, it's unanimous practically. And yet so few people are actually doing it. And to your point, there was a study that showed that they surveyed all these executives, and 96% said they didn't have time for strategic thinking. It's like, oh, okay, you don't have time for literally the most important thing.
Right.
Like, what is happening?
Yeah, I don't have time to sleep.
Exactly. So I wanted to dig into this a little bit to figure out what was actually going on. And of course, as you might imagine, there's the tip of the iceberg, which are the culprits that we all know. Like, well, yes, you have too many meetings, and yes, you have too many emails. That's not wrong, but it is also incomplete because part of what makes it so difficult for all of us is that on top of that, there are structural reasons why we may actually be a little bit sabotaging ourselves. And you were mentioning one of them. Sylvia Bellezza from Columbia Business School and her colleagues did some really interesting research about the fact that busyness in our modern lives has become a form of social status. And this is why for, so many times you probably hear this all the time. Oh, hey, how are you doing? oh man, I am slammed. I'm so busy. I'm crazy busy.
Am I looking
Like,
guilty here? Can you see the guilt on my face? Okay.
that's right. And we all do this. Well, why do we do this? We're the answers that we give in those moments, we're not going to give a socially unsatisfactory answer, right? Like, you probably wouldn't say, "Oh God, yeah, I'm so depressed. Like my
Totally.
life is so terrible." Like that's not how you answer that type of question.
Right.
You answer with a, "Oh, good, great," but the good/great is, "Oh, I'm so busy," because it telegraphs to people that you are in demand, that you're popular, that you're necessary, that you're important. And you do it in kind of this like humble brag way, but nonetheless, that's what's going on. And it can be very hard to extricate ourselves if the subconscious mindset is, wow, the busier I am, the more successful I am. The busier I am, the more important I am. And if we dial that back, it begins to threaten a lot about our identity and how we worry that other people will view us.
Yeah, it's a very interesting. I mean, there's so much in that, and we could probably talk for a whole hour about that. Do you think that is a function of the era we're in, or do you think it's a function of our country in this time and place? You know what I'm saying? Do you think it's kind of consistent across the West, or is it consistent across the world given the amount of stimulus that we're all kind of swimming through? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, is this a unique thing, or has this always been the case, you think?
It's becoming more pronounced for sure. Also, Sylvia's research shows that it's particularly pronounced in the United States, as you can imagine.
Sure.
We are products slash victims of our Puritan slash Protestant work ethic. So, I mean, I went to divinity school, so I studied this a lot. It was viewed in the Calvinist strand of theology that if you were successful financially and hardworking, that it was viewed as a sign, sort of worldly sign that you were among God's elect. So it was a really good thing to be
Yeah.
busy. It was a really good thing to be successful. And if you're in a cultural context where those things are not necessarily coupled so closely with salvation, then, I mean, it's not like people will turn down being wealthy, but it's not quite such a mandate.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, we almost treat it as like, well, this is our responsibility. This is, of course, this is the virtuous way to behave, and so we adhere to that.
Well, and the interesting part of that is in that sort of Calvinist approach, which is essentially, I mean, there's almost a juxtaposition of which is the sort of primary variable or the independent variable and which is the dependent variable, because in that, to the extent that your election is predestinated, then that work you're doing is sort of just your natural output. And yet we sort of flip that, or in some sense we flip it if it's in fact rooted in these sort of Puritan or sort of Protestant work ethics. We flip it by saying, well, if I'm exhibiting these things, then I must be this thing. And it just kind of starts to spiral out, and it's like, I don't know, it turns into like an Ouroboros or something. You know what I'm saying?
Well done. Good exegesis, Nicholas. I like it.
Thank you. I have a lot of different angles here. So I'd like to talk a little bit about back to like you building this community, because what it is now, I'm sure, well, let me ask you, how has this community that you've built and the impact that you've been able to sort of have on the world through your writing and through your thought leadership and all these other things on your path to becoming an international ambassador, how has that exceeded your expectations, and how has that differed from the picture you had in your mind as you sort of set on this path?
Yeah. Well, thank you for asking. So you're referring to the recognized expert community that I've built. It's a course and community, and it really started for me as a project, as kind of an experiment. I was writing my book, Entrepreneurial You, which was about how to create multiple income streams in your business, and we had been interested in creating online courses. And I'd done a little bit for other entities, partnering with LinkedIn Learning and various other places where I was creating courses for them. And I wanted to experiment and figure out how to do it on my own. And so I'm like, great, I'm gonna create this course. And so I survey my audience and I set up a pilot and I test it. And so I think a lot of it early on for me was really about the process of learning how to do this. Like, oh, cool, I'm going to build an online course. Let's see if I can figure out how to do it and how to crack the code. And of course, to provide something that people would find interesting and meaningful and would be willing to pay for. But I really thought of it as just kind of a learning project or an experiment. But over the past 5 years of running this community, and now 600 plus people have been through the program. And I even ended up dedicating my new book, The Long Game, to members of the Recognized Expert community. I think it's really taken on a life of its own in a lot of ways, because I think what it has enabled me to do or shown me is this is not, what we're talking about here is not just like, oh, hey, it's a cool thing that people like and I can teach them how to do it. I think in many ways is a little bit of a meta phenomenon where, I'm teaching a course that I would have loved to have had 15 years ago. Nobody was teaching such things, which is like, how really in a crowded and noisy environment, how can you get your ideas heard? And I was desperate to figure that out. But by doing it, I've realized that it really helps unlock the potential and the ideas of so many people. And to me, that's incredibly motivating and incredibly valuable to see them succeed in the world by applying some of these principles and being able to get the recognition they deserve for the good work that they're doing.
I mean, those are always my favorite stories, where you just kind of, it starts out as like an experiment. It starts out as just kind of like an exploration, and then you find this kind of promised land that you didn't even know existed. What's been your biggest surprise along this process?
Well, in terms of the Recognized Expert community, I would say one of the things that has been most powerful is the community. I try to like really emphasize now when I talk about it, that it is a course and community, because the original conception, again, it was just like, well, I'll do a course and I'll teach people things. It was very, it's not like egotistical per se, but it was just very standard. I'm like, okay, well, it's like a one-way direction of like, I'll teach people something they want to know, and then they'll pay money and then they'll learn it and it'll be great.
Yeah.
And that is great, but it's not what the course became. What the course became, because of the participants, this is really where the magic happens. I did a pilot with like 40 people, and they requested, this is always much better when they request things.
Yeah. I
originally was just going to have like course modules, but they're like, no, we want a community. We want to have a group together. And so, now 5 years later, everybody has a million reasons to have their gripes with Facebook, but we have it on a Facebook group because that's what the members requested. They're like, hey, let's have a Facebook group. I'm like, great. Okay, let's have one.
Yeah.
So I set it up, and it became this incredible engine for people to connect with one another. And I think it's very meaningful for me, because something that I'm acutely aware of in my own life, and certainly people I know, is that it does become honestly quite hard as an adult to make friends.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like once you're out of college, it's not like you're kind of tripping over people who are in the exact same situation as you. So you need to have vehicles for that. And especially if you're starting on a path where, like, let's say, especially where you're a solopreneur or you're starting your own business or something like that, you probably don't necessarily know a ton of people that are doing the exact same thing as you. And it can feel very lonely and very disorienting.
Totally.
Even if you're in a company and you're interested in like sort of finding a way to raise your profile or become a thought leader within your company. Again, most people are not on that path. They're not doing it. And so to find other folks that are on the same page, and you can learn from each other, you can be friends, you can support each other in that journey, having that kind of a curated group can become so valuable. And so to me, to see the friendships that have formed, I mean, people left and right, they're co-writing articles together, they're having each other on their podcasts. I mean, there's people literally that have they take vacations together. Amazing. They like travel across the country and dog sit for each other. I mean, they've become like super good friends. And seeing that is very meaningful.
How amazing. You started out with this thing that was just going to be kind of a linear path. Hey, you go through these steps, you go through this learning, and it's grown into this community. It's grown into this network with all these nodes, and there's so much magic that comes out of that as people sharpen each other and friendships are built that wouldn't have existed otherwise. I mean, how amazing, how rewarding. sorry to keep changing gears here, but there's so much I want to kind of chat with you about.
Oh, that's great.
So there's this concept in economics of sort of economic cost, and we sort of tend to think in accounting cost terms, which is like how much, how many dollars does this cost? The economic cost of something includes the opportunity cost, which you spend a lot of time talking about in the book. Why is it so hard? Like, we intellectually, I mean, anybody who's got an IQ probably of over 80 can understand this concept of opportunity cost, and yet it's a very small percentage of us that consistently incorporate opportunity costs in not only our long-term thinking, but also just our day-to-day decision set. Why is this concept so like slippery and hard to implement in our, day-to-day lives?
Yeah, opportunity cost is so tricky for so many reasons. And I think, and of course, I'm assuming most people who are listening to this podcast probably are very familiar with that concept. But for the people who might not be, the basic idea is if somebody offers you the chance to do something like, oh, hey, will you be on this podcast? Oftentimes what happens for most of us is we just take it as it comes and we try to evaluate up or down, like, do I want to be on this podcast or do I not want to be on this podcast? But actually, the question we need to be asking ourselves is, okay, this hour of my life, do I want to be on this podcast? Or is there literally anything else in the world that I could do with an hour that might be more valuable? Should I be working out? Should I be, hanging out with friends? Should I be answering emails? Like, what should I be doing? And I think that, first of all, one of the reasons why we don't do this is it's kind of an overwhelming question.
Yeah,
right. It's like, oh God, like, what should I be doing with my life? Like, this is kind of a big existential question.
No, that's an interesting angle. Yeah.
Yeah. I think also part of it is sometimes when we get into a sort of heads down mode where it's, we're a little busy, we're a little frenetic, something's coming into the inbox, we often tend to just want to dispatch it. And so sometimes it's just like, yeah, okay, I can do that. Click, and it's easier because we don't spend a lot of time processing but what else could I do? Or what are the long-term ramifications of X, Y, and Z? Sometimes it's easier, especially just to say yes and move on. So I think that's part of it. And also part of opportunity cost is understanding that we might not actually even know what the options are that might present themselves. Like, if you ask me to be on a podcast in December of 2023, I can say sure, because I don't have anything on my calendar for December 2023. Probably, though, by the time we get to October, November of 2023, there's going to be a lot of things that I might have options for that I just cannot predict right now. So those are some of the reasons why it's hard.
Yeah, kind of that next best option thinking is just so tough, and yet it's kind of this is one of the areas I think, people, let me back up. People talk a lot about like setting your plate, and if you don't set your plate, someone's going to set it for you. And as things kind of come down the pike and you just sort of are, as you said, you're dispatching them or you're just saying yes, or it's hard to kind of answer that existential question of like, well, what should I actually be doing at this time? We sometimes let those sorts of winds of life carry us where they will take us. And, the thing I was kind of struck with as in the book you were talking about opportunity cost, is like this difficulty that I'll just talk about myself. Like, I have a difficulty of saying no. I don't know if it's because I'm a people pleaser. I don't know what it is, but, and I don't know. And, that I don't know if it's sort of that fear of loss is greater than the desire for gain paradox that we all sort of are victim to. But sometimes it's like, I don't know how to say no. And you had some really, I thought, elegant kind of tactics for saying no. And I'm sure that you've had to exercise that muscle a lot as you become more popular and as there's more and more people vying for your time. Can you just share with us a couple of those kind of tactics that you continue to use that seem to work really well to allow you to kind of maintain, setting your plate as you see fit?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's true. It becomes harder for all of us, right? Because the truth is, when you're 22, you start your job, like, it's not like there's this huge line of people waiting to talk to you, right? You can pretty much say yes to everything and you're still going to have time in your schedule, like, no problem. But, 5 years in, 10 years in, 20 years in, there's just statistically, there's a lot more people that there's a lot more people that want things from you because you've presumably amassed some degree of knowledge or influence or whatever it is over time. And so there's more people seeking whatever it is that you have. So you do have to get smarter about it. So one super low hanging fruit strategy that I like to remind people of, which sometimes we forget because it seems counterintuitive. It actually seems like it might be less productive, which is to engage them further and ask for more information. Again, if we're in that frenzy mode of like, oh my God, I just have to get this out of my inbox, like, okay, fine, I'll have a meeting with you. Fine, I'll have a call with you. Well, that's one way of doing it, but it's a little short-sighted because oftentimes what I've discovered, this is like the sad truth about humanity, is a lot of people don't actually put a lot of thought into their requests. And so some of the things that they want to ask you for, or some of the reasons that they want to connect with you, are bonkers.
Right.
And if you just ask them for a little bit more information, like I now consider it a warning sign whenever anyone's like, oh, hey, Dorie, I have a few questions. I'd just love to grab a half an hour on your calendar. Can we set something up? And I'm like, about what? Because sometimes it's about things that I literally don't even know about, but they're just making some wild assumption. And sometimes it's because it's some totally inappropriate thing that they're kind of afraid to tell me. Oh, well, I wanted to spend a half an hour on the phone with you so I could get you to give me money. That's why.
Right.
Well, okay, I'm not really sure I want to spend a half an hour being pitched. So just that extra level of inquiring can sometimes save you a lot of time.
It's such a good hack. I mean, I've started using it already. And what I found is that like some people, they end up not even getting back to you. Or that it's just like it's like a minor screen. It's like you're not closing the door, you're just kind of closing the screen, and that's going to keep some of the bugs out. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well put.
Thank you very much. So I love this story about this woman who went to the freestyle rap thing, and I'd love to talk a little bit about that, especially in the context of do you think that the self-confidence, or do you think that we are ever able to truly get over, worrying about what other people think of us? Or do you think that you have to start over when you get into a new realm?
So I love this question. To just contextualize for folks who haven't yet read The Long Game, there's a story in there about a friend of mine named Alyssa Cohn. She's a very successful executive coach. And also, she signed up a couple of years ago for this rap class because she had gotten kind of into, she'd gotten very into Hamilton. And so she'd become a fan of Lin-Manuel Miranda as a result. And he had this new project called Freestyle Love Supreme Academy, which you can sign up and you can take classes that will teach you how to do improv freestyle rap. And she's like, okay, that sounds great.
Amazing.
And so she signs up. This was an in-person class. So she gets there and she immediately sort of suddenly realizes exactly what she has done because, she is this executive coach, this kind of buttoned up executive coach. And it's basically her and a bunch of like 20-year-old guys in hoodies. And she's like, oh, they actually know how to rap.
Yeah. She thought this was like a beginner swimmer's class or something.
Exactly. And so, her first day of the class, it's like so terrifying. Like they literally wanted them to rap gibberish and she was so stressed out. She couldn't. She's just like, pass. And she thought she couldn't hack it. So she sends an email to the guy who's running the class. And she says, oh, I think I've made a mistake. I think this isn't the right place for me. And he got back to her, he emailed her back, and he actually had some real wisdom to share. And what he told her was, look, we are not trying to make you a rapper. What we are trying to do is to help you become more creative and more uninhibited. And she thought, oh, right. I'm not actually trying to become a rapper, am I? That's actually what my goal was to be more creative and uninhibited. And she realized, all right, I guess I need to do this process because at the end of the day, it was about the kind of aspiring toward the kind of person that she wanted to become. And I think that that's sort of an important lesson for all of us. The way that it plays out in my own life, to your point, is, when it comes to like worrying about what other people think of us. I mean, I think that's always a factor, but also, I really came face to face with this in my goal of writing musical theater. I had literally never done it before. I was starting for sure from zero when I came up with this goal. I started it in 2016. So it was at the time my 10-year goal of writing a show that would end up on Broadway. And so I ended up getting into this musical theater training program, which, similar to Alyssa, I thought like, oh, good, a training program. That's what I need. And I get there and I realize there's literally people in the program who already have master's degrees in musical theater.
Jeez.
And I had never written it before. I'm like, oh, okay.
This is what I'm up against. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, literally my whole first year, I mean, it was just one humiliation after another. And I had a mantra for myself. I would just leave class, you know, when like whatever I had come up with had been like ripped to shreds again.
Yeah.
And I just said, okay, we do not derive our self-esteem from this activity. There are other things I do really well.
Okay. That's a very powerful mantra that I'm going to be probably singing to myself for the rest of my life. But, you know, maybe it takes a certain confidence to even take these plunges into realms that you're maybe not well versed in. But it's interesting that even sort of successful people, highly confident people, you know, your friend, you, who've stepped into these other realms, we still get shaken by like that feedback loop of, you know, this isn't going well. I can't do this. And, you know, finding some way to reframe it, whether it's saying, hey, I'm actually good at these other things, or reframing it and saying, well, I'm doing this as a means to a different end. Can kind of keep us on that track so that we can get through that J curve and kind of start to get the outcomes or the benefits from that process that we were hoping to get.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we are getting close on time here. I want to be very conscious of your time. One of my favorite quotes from early in the book was, "Ridiculous goals are not ridiculous forever." I love that so much. It is a super empowering It's a super empowering quote. Tell me about what that means for you in your life as you look toward your musical career, your ambassadorship, things like that. How do you continue to use that as a fuel to keep you on your track?
Yeah. Well, I think that a challenge that a lot of people have, you know, going, you know, sort of circling back to an earlier part of our conversation, is we often worry or assume that somehow if we state a goal that people are going to, you know, hold us to it so much that like, oh, well, you know, how are you going to achieve that? Like, break it down for me, explain to me how you're going to do this.
Right.
And, you know, that if we're somehow called to account and we don't know, it'll be this huge embarrassment. But again, I think just falling back on the understanding that it would be ridiculous and inappropriate to come up with like a step-by-step 20-year plan. The world and your life is going to change so much. It is going to render it completely useless. You know, whatever the 47,000 steps are that you have identified,
right.
Like almost immediately it is going to be inoperative. Mm-hmm. And so instead, what I really a drum I try to beat in the long game is try to be directionally correct. Just, you know, understand what you want to work toward and just keep doing your best to move north or, you know, whatever direction that you're going in. And so in terms of having, I think that fear keeps us from having the big goals, but I think there's not anything wrong with having big goals. I think it's actually quite motivating and quite empowering. And especially when we understand that we don't have to have it all figured out. Like part of the beauty, in fact, is getting allies along the way. You know, if I tell somebody, hey, I'd like to be a U.S. ambassador in 20 years, I think that that's far more likely to get allies, you know, of people who are excited and say, oh, that's great. You know, my uncle was the ambassador to Liechtenstein. You know, would you like to meet with him? And I'll be like, sure. Yeah, that sounds great. You know, you can make connections that way and get people excited and inspired along the way. Now, I think the problem, right, is where people say things that are patently ridiculous.
Yeah.
And, you know, and there's a difference. Can I be an ambassador in 20 years? Almost certainly. That's not to say that I will be, but it is completely plausible that I could be an ambassador in 20 years. Now, a completely different situation was I went out once with this woman who was an actress. You know, we had like a coffee, and she was saying, oh, well, I've set the intention and I'm going to have a show on Broadway next year. And I wanted to be polite, but I'm like, no, you're not. That's like literally not how it works. Like, yeah, right. Like I am very well versed in how it works. And so unless you actually have like $5 million in your back pocket and can give it to the Schuberts or the Niederlanders or Jujamsen and say, here's my deposit, you are for sure not going to be on Broadway next year. And so you sound like an idiot when you say things like that. But as long as you've researched it enough to understand what is hypothetically plausible, then there's no reason in the world why you couldn't do that thing and work toward that thing.
And, you know, you said something else, or I was struck with something as you were saying that. Sharing those big goals not only helps you find those allies, but it also helps you sort through the people that are really putting their own failures onto you. You know, as I look back at a lot of the naysayers in my own life, I'm not throwing stones at these people, but like, some people are threatened by big goals. Some people are threatened by the courage that it takes to say, I'm going to be an ambassador, or I'm going to write this book, or I'm going to build this community, or whatever it is we're talking about. And at some level, those kinds of people end up kind of holding you back, where there's a whole world of people that are going to cheer you on or be able to introduce you to their ambassador uncle or whatever. And you can start to cut some of those weights off from your ankles.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great point.
So, appreciate you. I love your work, love your book. Where can people find out more about you? Where can they get in touch with some more of your courses or become a part of your community?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, I appreciate it. For folks who want to learn more about the book, pick up a copy or download a free self-assessment, you can go to DorieClark.com/longgame and get all the links there. And for folks who want to learn more about the Recognized Expert community, just go to DorieClark.com/Rex, REX, and you can learn more about the Recognized Expert community.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Dorie, for joining us today on The Ethics Experts. Everyone, until next time.